Probably the most esteemed virtue in our culture today is tolerance. Everybody believes in tolerance. I'm a contrarian here on this point because the way I see it, when I see this notion being played out in culture, what passes for tolerance, it seems to me, is really just a substitute for intellectual cowardice. That is, people are not willing to engage an idea that they disagree with. They're not willing to either disprove it or be changed by it. Rather, they avoid engagement altogether by simply calling somebody an intolerant bigot, and then they sit back and feel good about themselves as the gracious, loving, tolerant kind. But I'm convinced in most cases it's just cowardice in disguise.
Well, this would depend entirely upon the situation at hand. Whilst I have seen those who merely throw out that X is intolerant before walking off, often being a Jew, a Christian or a Muslim who has come under criticism for their religion, this is not always the case. For the most part, in what I've seen, as well as what I attempt to strive towards, the word intolerant is a side remark, either placed as the conclusion at the end of a discussion with a hateful individual who seeks to dictate the lives of others, or it is placed at the very start before the speaker then goes on to explain why said person is intolerant. Jews, Christians and Muslims will often cry out anti-Semitism, religious persecution or Islamophobia to silence discussion. Not always, but in many cases this does occur. On the other foot, with minority demographics such as ethnic minorities or LGBT+ individuals, as well as larger demographics with a lot to lose, for example, women when discussing bodily rights, rarely will they utilize this method of intolerance before running off. Again, this is not in all cases, but a general observation. But why is that the case? Well, when it comes to minority groups or groups who actually have something such as bodily autonomy to lose, they have little option but to argue their case. If a theist throws a hissy fit at being critiqued, shutting down the conversation, they likely have nothing to lose power-wise. If, however, an LGBT+, ethnic minority or woman remains silent when people are trying to combat or strip them of their rights, they have a lot to lose. Now, seeing as you are a Christian group, I'm going to make the educated guess here that it is LGBT+ communities you often face off with in this manner. Therefore, I will go through several of your previous videos on this topic and discuss them in an open and polite manner. I will just be keeping to your videos, Greg. Brett won't be making an appearance here, but his time will come again as well. So with that, how about we start off with your video, The Bible on Homosexuality?
I've been asked, how do you present a biblical view on homosexuality? I mean, it seems to me, in terms of the content, that's quite simple. There are two things to keep in mind. The biblical view on the value of human beings and the biblical view on the conduct of homosexuality. So the first one is that human beings are made in the image of God and therefore deserve respect and kindness and tolerance in the classical sense. However, that doesn't mean that we disregard God's moral directives regarding certain behaviors. And the moral teaching on homosexuality is very clear in the scriptures. Between the Genesis passage on Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, I'd hardly say that it was clear from the Genesis account of Sodom and Gomorrah for a number of reasons. One, the sin of the two cities is rather vague in its apparent terms. The passage which most people like to point to in blame of homosexuality is Genesis chapter 19, verse 5, which the New International Version translates as, "They called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them.' In the King James Version, however, it merely states, "And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came in to thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them." But let us agree for a moment that they did indeed wish to rape the angels who were disguised as men at the time. Rape is not homosexuality, for one. But also, what does the story tell us about the Christian faith? Lot's actions following the scenario was to offer both of his virgin daughters to be gang raped by the crowd in their place. So the initial scenario was that two men were to be gang raped, and that, in Lot's eyes, was worse than having his daughters raped. Remember that Lot was the only righteous man in God's mind. So the man your God decided to save from Sodom and Gomorrah, above all others, including every beggar, every leper and child and baby, was a man who went raping men? How dare they rape my daughters in their place? Hell, they're only women. As for those who attempt to claim he had no other choice, how about praying to that supposed God of his?
And the Levitical passage on homosexuality, and also the Romans passage, Romans chapter 1, it becomes very, very clear that God's view of homosexuality is that it's a deep moral harm.
Okay, well, the Leviticus passage is a little hard to dispute, but this does then raise the question as to why you follow that law, but not the law forbidding tattoos or the law forbidding the consumption of shellfish or weaving of two fabrics together. It raises a whole new springbox of problems for the supposed strict and faithful believer. As for Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, it would appear to agree. But, and here is the very big but, if you read from passage 18 onwards, you will find that these men were apparently cursed by God for making images or idols of natural things, much like any child does in art class today. The passage states that God gave them to lust, and then he even supposedly cursed them with a depraved mind. But the problem then is that it then goes on to state through passages 29 to 31 that they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. So why bring this up? Why is this important in any way? Well, first of all, the passage talks about homosexuality not as a crime, but the supposed punishment for a different crime, as seen in verse 27, with "and received in themselves the due penalty for their error." Secondly, the listing mentioned before gives us a way to falsify the Bible's claims. LGBT+ individuals, as well as artists, are not full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are not void of understanding, fidelity, love, or mercy. We are good people as much as anyone else.
Leviticus calls it an abomination, and homosexuality is a crime under the theocracy that deserves capital punishment. Now, I am not suggesting that's the case now, that is, that should be punished in that way. That's not my view, because we're not under theocracy anymore.
So let me get this straight on two fronts. Point one, your God's laws are only operated under circumstances where your religion holds unquestionable authority, meaning that these laws are highly subjective rather than objective. Point two, the only thing stopping you from wishing death upon people such as myself is the fact that secular philosophy has spread throughout the West. Now, I'm trying to be nice here. But it is really hard when you openly admit that the capital punishment you would force upon innocent people who loved whom you deemed the wrong person is only no longer valid due to the fact that you no longer hold the power to give out said punishment. This would be like a person in chains going, "I don't support rape, but if I were a free man, I would screw the life out of your wife or husband whilst they screamed for mercy." It makes it just a little tad harder to empathise with you.
But I think that does tell us something about God's perspective about that particular thing. And we're not just restricted to the Leviticus passage or the Sodom and Gomorrah passage. We also have the passage in the book of Romans, which God makes very clear that homosexuality is a violation of the natural order that he created. In other words, and here you have to go to the New American Standard Bible, I think, for the crispest and clearest characterization or translation of this. But the problem there is that men and women in their homosexual behaviors abandoned the normal function of the two sexes. So God created opposing sexes, opposite sexes, to function in a certain way with each other. And here we're talking about plumbing when we use function language, not about desire. And since homosexuals abandoned the function of the opposite sex that God has created for them, then God then gives them over, basically, to this immorality. And this is the wording of Romans chapter 1.
No, as shown through the actual passages, the idolization was the actual crime, homosexuality was a supposed punishment. It would be great if you actually knew what your own religious text actually stated.
The most important thing is, from all of those passages, we get a perspective of God's understanding of homosexuality. It's wrong. Now, this is wildly politically incorrect, and you have to be careful how you characterize these things in public. What I try to do is I usually start with God's moral perspective and then add, but this is what God says about how we treat people. So there is no justification for anything like gay bashing, given the scriptural evidence, the total communication by God about man. And this is what people think when you say what's wrong. Of course, we don't bash other people with other sins just because we think they're wrong. So there's an inconsistency here. But in any event, God makes it very clear in both cases that homosexuals are human beings that need to be treated as such and with such respect, but also that homosexual behavior itself is wrong. And homosexuality is an example of a deep rebellion against God, and that's in Romans 1.
So pretty much your method is to be as disingenuous as possible. Your God orders the execution of an entire demographic by holy law, which you yourself acknowledged earlier. And you merely come along and go, well, I like to present otherwise. Also, as for your claim that Christians do not bash other sins, that is an utter falsehood to the degree of delusion. Anyone who has seen a picket line outside a clinic that offers safe abortions, or has heard these preachers go from campus to campus attacking women for dressing improperly, or atheists for accepting the devil, knows all too well that that is not true in any sense. Anyway, with the end of this video, how about we move on to, is same-sex marriage harmful to society? Maybe you'll shed some more light onto your supposed reasoning that you stand to.
The question I want to answer here briefly is has to do with same-sex marriage, and it's how do you convince a non-Christian that same-sex marriage is going to be detrimental to him? How is it going to hurt that person or people who don't share our spiritual convictions? And the difficulty here, of course, is that people have to see the long-term consequences of ideas, not just am I going to be hurt tomorrow with some same-sex couple living down the street or across town or something like that. And the answer is, of course, in that sense, probably nothing. But in the long term, there are going to be consequences because ideas have consequences.
Very true. Ideas do have consequences, yet at the same time, those ideas also stand and fall upon their own basis. Wild conjecture into what could occur down the line whilst being absent in any founded basis also has the problem that it may be utilised to police thought, including your own. So long as a person doesn't call for the direct breaking of a law, for example, in order to assault individuals of a certain demographic, then they are free to harbour whichever views they desire, as long as others are free to then tear down those ideas. Case in point, I am doing just that right now. I will have to demand for some damn good explaining to dig you out of this one. I really must insist upon it.
So let me try to lay it out. There are two options to the question, what is marriage? It is either something in particular or it's nothing in particular. It's either got a natural teleology, that means that nature or God, however you want to construe it, if you're talking with a non-Christian you could say nature, has established reality to be a certain way so that men and women get together to have children, and that's the foundation of society, families. And culture has a desire to protect that, or there is no natural teleology or natural end to marriage or family, and they can be anything you want them to be.
Well, this is an easy one. The ideals of marriage change throughout cultures and across the ages. Ergo, it appears to be something of symbolic value. But the symbolic value rarely ends there. Due to the involvement of multiple parties, marriage also acts as a form of binding contract simultaneously designed to protect the citizens of a society to a degree which is dependent upon how socially advanced said society is. For example, prior to the American Civil Rights Movement, this protection was not extended to those within interracial marriages, as they were perceived to be perversions of the natural order of things, people mixing outside their ethnic gene pool. Thankfully, modern ethics allowed for this to be questioned and later changed, and society gained on a whole from this adaptation.
Now, the same-sex marriage crowd wants to argue that marriage is a matter of definition and we can redefine it any way we want.
Actually, that was the Christian goal during the formation of the Odyssean Code, 4th century AD, which put in place laws that had previously not existed, restricting marriage throughout the Roman Empire to exclude same-sex couples. So what on earth are you talking about? We are only seeking to undo that redefining of marriage that Christianity made.
And therefore we can redefine it as same-sex marriage. If we decide to go with same-sex marriage, we will be admitting to their point of view. We will be conceding that ground and saying that marriage isn't anything in particular, that it's completely a social construction and we can define it however we want.
Actually, the argument is not to redefine marriage to homosexual marriage. It is to allow same-sex couples and any children that they may have the same protection under the law as we do opposite-sex couples. It is not gay marriage, it is marriage equality. As for the phrase social construction, do you know what else is a social construction? Try the whole of society, including democracy.
But once we do that, we have said we can define it however we want. And of course that would include same-sex marriage if we chose to do that, but it would include a whole lot of other things as well. Polygamy, polyandry, that's multiple husbands, one wife. Polyamory, that's like group marriage. Now when I bring this up as a consequence to the idea, people will respond and say, well, that's ridiculous. And I say, I agree, it is ridiculous, but it follows from your view.
Really? That was the worst you could do. Multiple consenting adults loving one another at the same time. The slippery slope fallacy really does not work to begin with, and it certainly does not work when you can only point to poly relationships. Let them marry, so long as all parties are consenting and nobody is coerced into it, i.e. as with some religious sects. Also, Greg, do you know which ancient text also contains numerous accounts of polygamy? I'll give you a hint. It starts with a B and rhymes with libel.
Once you say that there is no definition or natural teleology to marriage, that it can be anything you want to make it, it can be anything you want to make it. And what's to stop those things? The answer is nothing. They're already in the wings right now, legally speaking, ready to be on the ballot. People are already advancing those ideas. It's happened in other parts of the world. And by the way, there are more bizarre forms one could suggest, like, what about humans and animals? Now, I know you're thinking, that is the craziest thing. No one would ever think of that nonsense. This is what we said about same-sex marriage 20 years ago, and look at where we're at right now.
I knew this was coming. False equivocation. One is a scenario dealing with consenting adults. The other is dealing with animal rape. Why is it that Christian apologists have such a hard time wrapping their warped little minds around the basic concept of consent? Should we place you on a register somewhere to be monitored?
The point I'm making is ideas have consequences. Once we legally say that there is no distinction between a heterosexual couple and a same-sex couple as far as the law is concerned, because we can define marriage any way we want, then the sky's the limit, if you will. And who knows what's going to happen then? And the government will enforce it. That means a loss of personal liberty. That means a loss of religious freedom. That means a violation of parental rights, and these things are already happening. There's plenty to be concerned about, even if you're not a Christian, if same-sex marriage becomes the law of the land.
How on earth do you lose your liberty? Marriage equality will not force you to have a same-sex marriage. That's not what it means. This is like an intraracial couple complaining that by allowing interracial couples to marry, they will lose their liberty. How the hell does that work? As for religious freedom, your freedom of religion ends where my freedom from religion begins. Your freedom of religion does not have the right to dictate my liberty. That's why you cannot stone me to death and get away with it. And what on earth is this about parental rights? Same-sexed households have been found to do just as good as opposite-sexed households when comparing adoption cases. In some studies, the lesbian couples actually do better than both gay men and heterosexual couples. So you have completely failed to show any damaging consequences of marriage equality. You have merely gone, think of what could happen. It could be bad, I tell you. No, it will be bad, I tell you. And stuck a post-it note on it saying, argument. What is more is that you want your personal views, which are very finely veiled by your religion, to dictate the lives of others, to intrude on the liberty, the freedom and rights of your fellow citizens, and decide how they must live when dealing with a topic that affects you in no way or anyone else outside those benefiting from the extension of state protections. That, Greg, is what makes you an intolerant bigot. You can't be happy with wasting your own time, your own life on myths and legends, so you have to destroy the lives of others in the meantime. Marriage is a secular institution predating your religion by eons, and I am sorry to have to tell you this, Greg. It's time for humanity to take it back.